Imagine this. You are a young Roman bride. You've been prepared for this night since childhood. Your hair is woven into 6 braids, your white tunic tied with the knot of Hercules, believed to protect your chastity. You've been paraded through the streets from your father's house to your new husband's home, with neighbors, relatives, and slaves following in a noisy procession. But as the sun sets and the guests gather with torches, the true terror begins. Because tonight is not about love. It is not even about pleasure. It is about proof. Proof that you are what your family claimed you were. Untouched, pure, a worthy vessel for your husband's children. And to prove that, the Romans had a ritual that would send shivers down the spine of any modern bride. This is Rome's forgotten wedding night test. A test so humiliating and so feared that later historians tried to erase it from the record. A test that doomed thousands of women and decided whether they would live in honor or in shame. Roman marriage was never just a private affair. It was a public contract, almost a political treaty between two families. And a woman's virginity was the most valuable piece of that contract. It guaranteed that any child she bore would belong to her husband's bloodline, and not some other man's. This meant that proving virginity wasn't a formality. It was life or death. At the heart of this terrifying ritual was the idea of testatio, a public witnessing of the consummation. In its earliest form, neighbors or family members would wait outside the bridal chamber, sometimes even inside, until they were certain the marriage had been physically completed. But for many brides, this wasn't just a matter of awkward sounds through the door. Midwives or matrons could be summoned to verify that the bride was indeed a virgin. If no blood was produced, or if there was suspicion that she had been spoiled, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Some brides were dragged back to their fathers' houses in disgrace, their dowries forfeited, their marriages annulled on the spot. Others were beaten by their new husbands for bringing shame into the household. In the most extreme cases, especially in conservative patrician families, women could be exiled, abandoned, or even killed for failing the test. This was not simply a wedding night. It was a trial. And for thousands of Roman women, it was the most terrifying night of their lives. But why did the Romans do this? What superstition, what religious belief justified turning a wedding night into a public ordeal? And how did some brides escape the horror, while others suffered fates worse than death? The Romans saw marriage as far more than a union between two people. It was a sacred duty, a ritual that linked families, appeased the gods, and ensured the survival of the state. For the bride, this night was not just about leaving her childhood home. It was about passing through a spiritual threshold. She was leaving behind the protection of her father's household spirits, and stepping under the watchful eye of Juno, the goddess who guarded marriage and childbirth. This crossing was dangerous. The Romans believed that if the transition was not carried out correctly, disaster could follow. The bride had to be pure, untouched, unblemished by scandal. Anything less risked angering the gods and inviting tragedy into the marriage, infertility, sickness, or even death. A bride who was not a virgin was seen as a spiritual pollutant. She could defile the ritual and doom the union before it had even begun. The night itself was treated as a religious ceremony. The bride was taken from her home, sometimes carried over the threshold to symbolize her abduction. This was no coincidence. Rome's foundation myth told of women stolen from neighboring tribes and forced to become wives. The wedding night was meant to recreate that primal act, turning a girl into a wife in a single moment. Even the marriage bed was sacred. The posts might be decorated with wool, offerings might be made to the household gods, and the act of consummation was seen as a ritual sacrifice. There was pressure for the bride to bleed, proof that the union had been pure and successful. If she did not, suspicion would fall on her, her family, and the possibility of producing legitimate heirs. When the ritual went wrong, the consequences could be brutal. A husband had the legal right to reject a wife if he believed she had deceived him. Under the older form of Roman marriage, the woman ceased to belong to her father's household and came fully under her husband's control. He could punish exile or even kill her with little fear of reprisal if she was judged to have dishonored him. A failed wedding night was considered a public disgrace, one that could stain the reputation of both families. Whispers of witchcraft and curses sometimes circulated when a marriage failed to be consummated. Romans believed that jealous rivals could use magical knots or incantations to render a man impotent, turning a private humiliation into a public scandal. If no proof of consummation could be shown, the couple might face shame for the rest of their lives. The entire process reveals a society consumed with control over women's bodies, over fertility, over the approval of the gods themselves. For the bride, there was no way to hide, no chance to delay. Fear or pain were no excuse. The act had to happen and everyone would know whether it had or not. This was why Roman brides often wept on their wedding night. It was not merely a moment of intimacy, but a test, a trial that could define the rest of their lives. The household waited for proof, and if it did not come, consequences could be swift and merciless. And this was only the beginning. In some families, the wedding night was not just a private affair. There were witnesses, attendants, sometimes even midwives waiting to see the outcome. Some brides faced humiliations that turned the bedroom into something closer to a courtroom. Others resorted to desperate tricks to avoid disgrace. For many Roman brides, the wedding night was not an intimate encounter at all, but a performance staged for an audience. Though the couple was technically alone, attendants often remained just outside the chamber, waiting for a sign that the ritual had been completed. The air would be thick with tension, servants holding lamps, relatives whispering behind curtains, and everyone listening for the sounds that confirmed the act had taken place. Sometimes this need for proof went even further. In certain households, the marriage bed itself became a piece of evidence. At dawn, the sheets might be examined for blood, the ultimate sign of virginity. This gruesome ritual could decide the fate of the bride. A stained sheet meant triumph, honor, and fertility for the family line. A clean sheet meant suspicion, disgrace, and perhaps the beginning of a nightmare. The bride knew this as she lay there. The weight of generations pressed down on her. She was not simply a young woman with her own hopes and fears, but a vessel for family honor, a symbol of Rome's ideals. Failure was not private, it was public, and it carried consequences that could destroy her life. Some historians believe that these inspections were not just domestic rituals, but were at times demanded by the wider community. The elite had much to gain from proving a marriage legitimate. Property, inheritance, and political alliances all depended on the assurance that the union was real, and that future children would be recognized as rightful heirs. If there was any doubt, the bride could face interrogation. Relatives might pressure her to confess, or worse, accuse her of deceit. The law gave the husband immense power. If he decided she had defiled the marriage with prior relations, he could send her back to her father's house in disgrace, or even call for harsher punishments under older Roman custom. Faced with this unbearable pressure, some brides resorted to deception. Ancient sources whisper of women who smeared blood from an animal onto the sheets, or even pricked their own fingers to fake the expected sign. These acts were dangerous gambles. If discovered, the deception itself could be seen as proof of guilt, and punishment would be inevitable. But the fear was not always about the bride. Sometimes the husband himself failed to perform, and this too was a source of public shame. Romans saw virility as proof of masculinity, a sign of divine favor. A man who could not consummate his marriage risked humiliation and mockery, his family's reputation at stake alongside his own. This is where darker accusations crept in. Rivals might be accused of binding him with magic, or of cursing the union to prevent heirs. This obsession with proof created a chilling atmosphere where love had little room to exist. The wedding night was not about tenderness, but about duty, spectacle, and survival. It was a test in which the bride was the one most likely to suffer, for she was the one whose body would bear the evidence, or the lack of it. And when a bride was found wanting, when the test failed, the punishments could be swift and terrifying. Some women were cast out, divorced before the marriage had truly begun. Others faced public humiliation, their names ruined. A few were beaten or even executed by their own husbands, their deaths justified as a defense of family honor. This dark ritual, hidden behind the facade of Roman civilization, shows a society where even the most private moment was turned into a public judgment. The wedding night was a courtroom, the bed a witness, and the bride the accused. When the dreaded morning revealed no proof of consummation, the scene could turn from quiet dread to explosive crisis. The husband's family, desperate to protect their honor, might storm into the room, demanding explanations. A single night's failure could unravel months of political negotiation and cost entire fortunes in broken dowries. In some cases, this private crisis became a public spectacle. Roman courts were no strangers to hearing accusations of fraud in marriage contracts. A bride accused of entering the union without virginity could face official scrutiny, with her father's honor dragged through the dirt as well. This was not just a personal failing. It was a perceived betrayal of Rome's moral fabric, and for the bride, the situation could turn deadly. The Romans held to the idea of patria potestas, the absolute power of the male head of household. If he judged the bride guilty of dishonoring the family, he could order punishment that would shock us today. Whipping, public shaming, or even death were not out of the question in the earliest days of the Republic, and echoes of these harsh traditions lingered long after. Imagine the fear that must have gripped these young women. They had been paraded through the city, crowned with flowers, draped in veils, and carried over the threshold as symbols of purity and continuity. Then, in a single night, they could find themselves facing disgrace or death, their fate decided by whispers outside a bedroom door. Roman society even had chilling rituals for when a marriage was dissolved on these grounds. The bride's dowry might be withheld, effectively leaving her destitute. Her family could be shamed for raising a dishonorable daughter, weakening their standing in Roman politics and society. For elite women, whose marriages were often alliances between powerful families, this could mean the ruin of dynasties. In the most extreme cases, there are accounts of women executed under accusations of adultery, even when no affair had taken place. Failure to bleed on the wedding night was taken as evidence enough. These stories were retold by Roman historians as cautionary tales, serving to keep future brides terrified and obedient. Nor was this cruelty reserved for the innocent. If a bride had truly hidden a scandal, a secret lover, a lost virginity, the exposure of her secret could lead to ritual punishment. Some sources describe women being stripped and paraded through the streets, their shame made into a public lesson. Even the gods were invoked in these matters. Sacrifices could be offered to purify the household if the marriage was considered cursed. The bride might be forced to participate in humiliating rites meant to cleanse her of impurity, as though her very body had offended the gods. This obsession with purity was not just about the couple, it was about Rome itself. Marriage was seen as the engine of the state, the way to produce legitimate heirs and keep the citizen class strong. Any threat to that system, no matter how small, was treated as a threat to the very order of the Republic. The result was a culture in which the wedding night was less a beginning and more a trial by ordeal. To survive, it was to pass into a new life. To fail was to risk not only personal ruin, but the collapse of one's entire family's standing. And yet, these rituals and punishments persisted for centuries. Brides continued to step over the threshold, trembling, knowing that one night would determine the rest of their lives, or even whether they would live at all. There are chilling accounts in Roman history where the so-called wedding night test became a death sentence. The poet Juvenal wrote bitterly about women being cast out and sent back to their families in disgrace, sometimes beaten half to death by their new husbands. In some cases, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. When a bride was accused of failing her duty, the paterfamilias could legally convene a family council to judge her fate. These councils were not courts in the sense we think of today. They were grim private gatherings where fathers, uncles, and brothers decided a woman's life as though she were property, which, in Roman law, she was. If the verdict was harsh, the punishments could be savage. Some were forced into ritual humiliation, paraded naked through the house or beaten with rods as servants looked on. Others were strangled in silence, their deaths recorded as a sad but necessary cleansing of the household's honor. And some were cast out onto the streets, stripped of dowry, condemned to poverty. For a Roman woman of high birth, exile from the family could be worse than death. She would become a social ghost, unable to remarry, unable to reclaim her status. Even more terrifying were the cases where the state became involved. During Augustus's moral reforms, adultery was criminalized, and suspicions surrounding a bride's virginity could escalate into public trials. Some women were sent into forced labor, exiled to barren islands, or executed as examples to others. The emperor prided himself on restoring Rome's morals, but in doing so, he turned private humiliation into state-sanctioned terror. There are also scattered references to far darker rituals that bordered on the sacrificial. Some accounts hint that in earlier periods of Rome, a dishonored bride could be offered to the gods as a way of purging the community's guilt. While these stories are rare and shrouded in myth, they suggest that the fear of divine punishment was not just metaphorical. A failed wedding night might be seen as a curse on the household, and only blood could lift it. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine lying awake, knowing that your future, your family's honor, your very survival depended on something as private as what happened, or didn't happen, behind a closed door. Imagine the weight of generations pressing down on you, the fear that if you failed, your name would be spat upon, your body shamed or broken. Even the women who passed were not necessarily safe. Their bodies were inspected, their sheets displayed, their most intimate experiences turned into evidence. They were reminded that they were not individuals in the modern sense, but instruments of Rome's destiny. The entire ritual was a way of stripping them of autonomy, ensuring that their lives belonged first to their husbands and ultimately to the state. Historians now argue that this ritualized terror was a form of control as much as morality. It kept women fearful, obedient, and firmly in their prescribed roles. And because the consequences were so severe, the legend of the wedding night test spread far and wide, magnifying its power. Even centuries later, as Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the basic expectation remained. A bride's worth was measured by one night. A single failure could undo her life, and for thousands of women across centuries it did. The history of Rome is littered with cases where the wedding night test wasn't just a private affair, it became public theater. One of the most famous examples comes from the early imperial period, when Emperor Augustus turned morality into state policy. He demanded that Rome return to its ancient virtues, and no one was spared scrutiny, not even members of his own family. Augustus's daughter Julia became the most infamous casualty of this moral crusade. Though her case involved accusations of adultery rather than the literal wedding night test, it revealed just how far the state was willing to go to control women's sexuality. Julia was paraded as the model of virtue, but when accusations surfaced that she had taken lovers, she was not just divorced. She was banished to a barren island in disgrace, left to wither away. Roman historians, ever eager to blend gossip with morality tales, record other chilling examples. In one case, a bride accused of failing to prove herself was dragged before the family council, condemned, and reportedly executed by her own father. The entire ordeal was kept quiet, but servants whispered of the girl's screams echoing through the household. Her name was erased, and her death written off as a domestic matter. Then there were cases where accusations were weaponized. A powerful husband who wanted to rid himself of a politically inconvenient wife could claim that she had failed him on the wedding night, a stain that could not be undone. Without modern forensic evidence, such accusations were almost impossible to disprove. The woman's testimony mattered little, and once a wife was disgraced, her natal family might refuse to take her back, fearful of their own reputations being tainted. Even Rome's poets saw the cruelty of the system. Ovid, writing with a touch of satire, described how men gloated over their victory on the wedding night, as if the woman's body were conquered territory. His words hint at a culture that celebrated domination, where the bride's experience mattered less than the public proof of her submission. By the time of the Julio-Claudian emperors, the ritual had grown even darker. Rumors circulated that some imperial brides were deliberately humiliated as part of court politics. One scandalous story tells of a noblewoman whose wedding night sheets were displayed not to her family, but to the emperor himself, as though her private life were entertainment for the ruling elite. And then there were the cases that blurred the line between ritual and spectacle. In certain rural festivals, symbolic reenactments of the wedding night test were performed in public, with spectators watching actors simulate the event. These grotesque spectacles reminded the audience, and women in particular, of their duty to Rome. The theme that runs through all these accounts is fear. Fear was the glue that held the system together. The wedding night became a trial by ordeal, one that every Roman bride had to endure. And even if she survived it, she could never escape the shadow it cast. The whisper of scandal could follow her for years, waiting to be revived by an enemy, a jealous relative, or a scheming politician. The true tragedy is that these stories were rarely about individual justice. They were about preserving a collective illusion that Rome's families were pure, its bloodlines untainted, its citizens virtuous. And to uphold that illusion, countless women were sacrificed, some literally, others socially, all of them trapped in a system that made their bodies the battlefield on which Rome's morality was fought. The deeper we look into this ritual, the clearer it becomes that its power was not merely physical but psychological. For many Roman women, the wedding night was not a celebration, it was a test they had been dreading since childhood. Girls grew up on cautionary tales about brides who failed their first night and brought ruin on their families. It was a haunting warning, whispered by mothers and grandmothers. Don't bring shame to this house. This fear shaped behavior long before the ceremony itself. Girls were trained to be silent, obedient and docile, because any hint of rebellion might later be used against them. The Roman ideal of the matrona, the perfect wife, was one who endured whatever was demanded of her. Even philosophers like Seneca, who wrote about ethics and virtue, spoke of wives as possessions whose duty was to be chaste and submissive. The ritual also had an unspoken but very real political function. Marriage in Rome was rarely about romance. It was about alliances, property, and bloodlines. A single whisper that a bride had been unfaithful or had failed the test could destroy a carefully arranged marriage contract, unraveling political plans that might have taken years to forge. In this way, the wedding night became not just a personal ordeal, but a matter of statecraft. It's easy to imagine how this constant pressure broke some women entirely. Ancient sources record suicides of young brides, some before the wedding even took place, leaving behind notes begging their families not to think ill of them. One chilling inscription from a Roman tombstone mentions a girl of just 13 who chose death over disgrace. Men too were trapped by the ritual, but in a different way. The groom was expected to perform and to produce the proof of consummation by dawn. Failure on his part was considered humiliating, a stain on his masculinity. Some sources suggest that male relatives or even household slaves were called upon to assist if the groom faltered, a disturbing glimpse into how little privacy these newlyweds were allowed. And then there was the spectacle of public gossip. Roman society thrived on rumor. If the sheet was not displayed, or if the bride's family was not satisfied, the scandal spread like wildfire. Street poets and satirists would mock the couple in verses chalked on public walls, turning their personal nightmare into entertainment for the masses. The long-term consequences of such a system were devastating. Women lived with the knowledge that their worth could be reduced to a single night, a single moment, a single rumor. This constant scrutiny created an atmosphere of paranoia that lingered throughout their lives. For many women, the wedding night marked the beginning of a lifetime of control. Once a bride was proven, she became the property of her husband's family, her future tied entirely to his will. If she ever fell out of favor, her husband could use the events of that first night as ammunition, accusing her retroactively of deceit, even years later, to justify divorce or worse. The Roman obsession with purity, chastity, and control over women's bodies became a model that would echo throughout European history. Later societies borrowed Rome's practices, transforming them into similar rituals, punishments, and trials, always aimed at keeping women under scrutiny. The wedding night test may seem like a bizarre, cruel relic of a distant past, but it was far more than just an odd tradition. It was Rome's way of controlling the most intimate part of life, of bending personal relationships to the will of the state. And in doing so, it left deep scars on everyone involved. For women, it turned one of life's most private and personal moments into a public trial. There was no room for fear, pain, or hesitation, only the expectation of perfection. The young bride, often just a child, knew that failure would mean humiliation, punishment, or the end of her family's reputation. Even if she survived the night, she carried that terror with her forever. This is perhaps the most disturbing part. The ritual was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a lifelong surveillance system. Women's behavior, speech, and even facial expressions were monitored by in-laws, neighbors, and slaves. Any sign of disobedience or passion outside her marriage could be used against her. The wedding night was the opening act in a performance she would have to maintain until her death. And yet, despite all this control, Rome could not hold its grip forever. By the empire's later years, moral scandals erupted regularly. Poets mocked senators for their corrupt private lives. Historians lamented the decadence of Roman matrons who took lovers openly. Perhaps this was the inevitable result of centuries of forced purity. A society that policed its women so harshly eventually saw them rebel in secret in ways that shocked the moralists of the day. There is a dark irony here. Rome believed that by controlling its brides, it was protecting its social order. But some historians argue that this obsessive fixation on chastity and honor contributed to Rome's instability. By reducing women to symbols, by turning their lives into tests and spectacles, Rome created tension that boiled beneath the surface. Every scandal became political, every failed marriage a crisis, every rumor another crack in the fragile facade of Roman respectability. When we look at this forgotten ritual now, it forces us to ask a haunting question. How many lives were destroyed so that a society could maintain its illusion of order? How many terrified brides bled on their wedding night, not from love, but from fear? This was Rome at its most intimate and its most brutal, and for thousands of women, the wedding night was not the beginning of a new life. It was a sentence they had no choice but to serve. Perhaps that is why these stories still chill us 2,000 years later, because they remind us that even in the heart of one of history's greatest civilizations, the cost of honor was measured in the suffering of the most powerless. And that is Rome's forgotten wedding ritual, a test that doomed countless brides and left behind a legacy of pain that history has only just begun to confront.